A very brief introduction and welcoming of the speakers. Right. So first of all, welcome to everybody. Good morning, afternoon, wherever you are, all over the world. And this is the first event jointly organized by the Leader Lab of the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna and AREC. To prominent research institutions. And this specific awareness panel, which is broadly devoted to dynamic consent, it's also linked to two of the research projects in which we are working, European 2020 Horizon 2020 funded projects, which are SoBigData++, and especially legality attentive data scientists, from which actually two of our speakers are from. What we are trying to achieve with this awareness panel is to start discussing in a dynamic way with different expertises and from different experiences. I do know that AREC has more than one project on biome banks and works on dynamic consent from that perspective in a very pragmatic way, starting to talk about and try to do a sort of finding the borderlines of the issue. Our panel today, it's comprised. I'm going to very quickly introduce our speakers. The first two speakers are a prominent contribution from AREC by Dr. Mascalzoni that I just mentioned, and by Dr. Roberta Biasotto. And they will actually start Deborah from an actual real research case, while Roberta Biasotto will approach the participant perspective on the concept of dynamic consent. From our side, the Leader Lab side, we have a double contribution. One with a sort of first survey, if you want, on dynamic consent, what are the different options and research options, especially related with research, and I have the pleasure and privilege to have as speakers two ESRs, two PhD candidates and early stage researchers, Tommaso Crepax and Christian Lepore, which are in two different institutions. Tommaso is directly with us in Pisa at Leader Lab. Christian is in France at UT3, and both of them have quite a link with issues from their own angle as ESRs. Last but not least, still from the Leader Lab, Julia Schneider, was since very few days researchers at Catholic University in Milan. So she has a formal different affiliation, but as we say, once in Leader Lab, sempre in Leader Lab. So it's part of our community. Now, the whole aim here is to start the discussion, and I will just provide only two very short background considerations. Especially in some specific fields of research, like biobanks, genetic research, especially before they enter into force of the European data protection framework. One way of enlarging the scope of research has always almost naturally been trying to have a larger scope for consent, blanket versions of consent, wide consent formula for the use of data, and especially in this case, in my example of genetic data. This approach, which has been somehow put in trouble by the first entry into force of the European framework, somehow revised in the second wave, meaning the GDPR, was at the same time questioned by scholars, especially because the issue that was mostly questioned was whether or not was ethically sound to acquire in such a dynamic environment research a wide a sort of a wide check, a void check from the data subjects, and basically, broadly speaking, if we move beyond the borders of personal data protection to the patients and human subjects, such a wide concept. Several scholars criticized this approach as being not up to the ethical standards which was treated. And to a large extent, the discussion around personal data protection has helped this set of arguments, because as we all know, consent should be specific, meaning strictly related to a clearly identified scope for processing the data. It is also true, and that's very roughly almost the end of my very short introductory speech. It's also true that if we look to the GDPR, although it's rather clear that consent needs to be specific, cannot be too generic, there is quite a large scope stressed by several referrals and in the interplay between different set of rules in the GDPR that gives enough room to provide a sort of balance between large but still specific consenting to data processing, especially for research purposes, and especially in a public oriented, public interested oriented ones. Yet, even under this reading that somehow I advocate, still the idea of being able to have a more close control, if you want, check and confirmation on the consent in a dynamic way, I think it's still on the table. That's one of the reasons of high interest. And it's still on the table because some other normative frameworks which are forthcoming somehow envisage this possibility in a broader sense on other subdomains. I'm thinking to the Data Governance Act, for instance, which is in its final stages of approval. So this leads us to basically two main research fields that needs to be integrated. One is trying to understand what is the normative framework, and in this case, normative framework encompasses both the legal dimension, so what can or cannot be done in a legal way, and the ethical ones. So even though still there is quite a large, not infinite, but significantly appreciable leeway for broad consents under the GDPR, still we have to question under different circumstances in terms of, for instance, whether or not the scope of research switches from public interested to private commercial oriented, for instance, whether there is some need to have a more stringent ethical framework that require to enable in a pragmatical way the data subject to withdraw or limit further the consent. On the other hand, the second issue, we do need to have some actually viable tools to do it. Otherwise, this will be, on the one hand, a nightmare for the researchers in dealing and managing a dynamic consent, and on the other hand, a practical impossibility for data subjects to exercise their rights. So that's basically the basic background for this awareness panel, because we want to raise the awareness on these issues on the one hand, and start a serious discussion on this across the board and across the different projects and institutions involved. Having said that, I immediately stop my sharing, and I give the floor to our first prominent speaker and co-organizer, Deborah Mascalzoni.
Thank you for having us. This is really a pleasure for us to be able to start this collaboration, and we hope this is the first of several instances in which we might be able to have this exchange between practical world and more prominent theoretical world. So I hope to provide you today with some examples on how dynamic consent has been used in practice. Can you confirm me that you can see the presentation at this stage? Great. So I will watch the screen with the presentation, so do not forgive me if I'm not watching into the camera all the time. So we started to work on dynamic consent looking at the perspective of the participant, trying to see how to put together the needs of the participants and of the researchers. So somehow reversing the perspective of allowing research to happen from the researcher side. And this has produced very impactful results. We know that we are living in a world in which the scientific paradigm changed considerably. The new technology are changing constantly with the introduction of AI systems that really develop and integrate data through algorithms, increasing the complexity on how we face a privacy issue. At the same time, there is a need for continuing in getting high quality data from participants in research. And also, the possibility to translate science really heavily depends on this possibility to interact with participants. So having a static consent seemed quite a limitation to that new scientific paradigm. At the same time, on the scientific side, there is this big push for open science that is embedded into several frameworks, including the funding schemes. It means that we need to integrate data in research sets and in research aims by overcoming the tension between autonomy and integrity and the advancement of science. Is this possible? So we started from the question, should informed consent to be set in stone in an age in which nothing is set in stone, but we are really having the possibility to use new technologies and new communication tools for everything. Of course, starting from advertisement to new schooling that happens online with new tools, etc. So why not to use this also for ethical tools? We started to work with dynamic consent in the CRIS study in 2011, where the implementation of the dynamic consent already was in place. So the cooperative health study happens in South Tyrol, which is a northern region at the border with Austria in Italy, and is a region in which two languages are spoken, Italian and German. This is a study that is a population study that out of which a biobank is created. It means that we are inviting people, and so far we have 13,500 participants in the study, asking them to provide comprehensive data sets about their health, their lifestyle, etc., but also collecting biosamples out of which DNA is extracted and genetic data, of course. Hospitals and primary care physicians are involved in the study, but the study is run by a research center. It's meant to last at least 25 years, so it means that we will see these people several times over the years. And we needed an interactive tool, as I said, not only from the participants' perspective, but also from the research side, from the needs of research. So this is where the study takes place in the beautiful valley in Valle Venosta. And this is what happens. Dynamic consent is embedded into a complex communication system that needs to be dynamic as well, and into a governance that needs to be adaptive and dynamic as well. So participants are invited, they receive information through the media. They receive a classic invitation letter with a brochure that is tailored to their needs, with images and concepts that are explained, such as privacy, data sharing through networks, etc. But then, like a more technological level takes place. They are reminded about what they are needed to take to the study through SMS, for instance. They watch an information movie when they come to the center that reminds them about all the legal constraints and about all their rights. So everyone watched this movie before going into the authorization of the use of the dynamic consent platform and before going into the web-based dynamic informed consent. This is a personal web page where people can log in through username, password, and a secondary authentication mean, and fill in their consent. And furthermore, later be able to change this consent if conditions change, or if they are informed about something that they don't like, or they are able to reconsent and be involved in further studies. They receive updates through the personal web page, and they are able to be involved in further studies. So first of all, we start with authorization to the dynamic consent platform with a very, well, this is an authorization really that renders effective their possibility to fill in online consents and change their options. They have this personal dynamic consent webpage in which they find information about the study and updates about the study and what happens with their data. It also provides access to their personal clinical results. For instance, they do blood tests when they come to the study, and they have electronic health records that they provide to us that may be available for the future. And is also usable for remote phenotyping. And this has been the case, for instance, during the pandemics, in which we were able to recruit over 5,000 participants in a few months because we were able to use this online tool without having them to come physically to the hospital. Of course, to sustain that, we need a comprehensive information. Dynamic consent only is meaningful from an ethical and legal point of view if it is supported by substantial information. And therefore, we have different approaches and we use different tools. So the classical brochure, like a summary of the main important points, the movie, they have the web page with the information that they can dig into, and they can receive information through phone, through apps, and by going into their personal web page. This means that they can also choose how much they want to be bothered by the information we provide. Of course, there are levels for which they need to read the classical information, but we also cared about contextual information, contextual communication, and people can choose how much they want to be involved. We aimed for a broad description of the research aims. Is not a blank consent, but is still quite broad. It's cardiovascular diseases, and so it really comprises a lot. But along with the broad description of aims, we also have specific security information, available information about data handling, governance mechanisms, expectation, and how the continuous information is handled. It means that the dynamic consent needs to be embedded into a comprehensive governance framework for the flow and for the use of data. And this is the cornerstone for enabling dynamic consent. So we have a governance of the study, and this is available to the participants. We have an access committee that evaluates all the single studies that wants to access the data. We have oversight of the single projects that wants to use the data from the biobank. And we have binding transfer agreements with the collaborators that wants to use the data. So like the consent is embedded into laws and regulation, into rules of accessing the data that were created by the biobank, SOPs that render the secure handling of data and samples really a reality, and also like an LC strong protocol that is available to the participants. We also have a strong privacy policy that, of course, is given to the participants and is available and explains all the procedures from the pseudonymization, from the implementation of security and the adherence to the different laws. So we have different options that we offer, for instance, about data sharing, whether they want to share their data more internally or with external partners or with extra European partners. We have secondary finding options, and we have steps to return findings to participants. We have options, for instance, what happens if they are become incapacitated, or if they die. And I mean, in general, we have options for several tools, not too many though, because every option requires an explanation. So it means that dynamic consent can also be multi-step and offering further options if required by the situation. So as it happened with the pandemics, in which we offer the possibility to be part of further studies, etc. So what is dynamic consent in synthesis? It ensures to biobank research conformity with legal and ethical requirements. It's a bit more than consent because it becomes really a tool of communication with participants that can be used for remote recruitment. That is something that researchers are more and more looking for. It allows consent and reconsent processes, allows information flows. And as we know, the GDPR requires at least, for instance, notification of the use of data, even in case of secondary uses. This is something that allows this to happen quite easily, even if you go for broader description of the aims of research. Of course, management and costs and oversight of what is happening with the data, which is a huge problem for biobanks and hospitals, is significantly lower and more efficient. And also there is a greater accountability because everything is so transparent, and we notice increased trust. We have quite high participation rates in this project, and Roberta will show how this is also related to dynamic consent. Our idea is really to go from research subject to partners in research. And our idea is that dynamic consent is one of the tools that we can use to go in this direction. So should today consent be set in stone? I leave the question open for our panel.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for that very, very, very effective and challenging presentation. I would have already a number of technical questions to ask about the project, but I refrain myself. But I just stress an element that I'm sure that will come up also in more than one of the other presentations. That is the opportunities of dynamic consent. So I think one of the last message you just framed, it's a very powerful one, I think, that is referred not only to the original reasons for which even the idea of dynamic consent was born, that is try to have a more ethically adapted approach to consent, because there might be somehow an exploitation of an imbalance of powers between the researchers and people giving consent. But now you are opening up, and I'm sure that it will come up in many occasions, also to a completely different dimension. That is, we can serve at the same time. That's our usual approach, by the way. We can serve at the same time legality and ethicity of what we are doing in data processing, broadly speaking, in research, without impairing efficiency. To the contrary, basically, if we have a good and effective infrastructure, actually dynamic consent can increase the possibility of doing research, not only for expanding research, but just for recruitment of people. So thank you very much for that. And I immediately hands over a virtual microphone to our colleague Belotti. So please have the floor. If you have to share as well, you can share the screen. Thank you, Dr. Biasot.
Robby, non ti sentiamo.
I think I have to first unmute and then share. Sorry about that. I hope that was the issue. So now I'm on mute and now I start sharing. Okay, do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So, hi all, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar today. As you heard from Deborah's presentation, dynamic consent is an informed consent model that is suitable for biobanking and long-term studies where future uses of data and samples are not established at the time of recruitment. In fact, dynamic consent allows participants to revise and change their choices on participation over time. It also includes an ongoing communication with participants that is meant to keep participants informed and engaged with the study. In the CRIS study, the dynamic consent consists of an online interface where participants express their choices. The CRIS communication strategy uses multiple media from traditional to digital. It's targeted to the participants, but also to the community and the different stakeholders, with materials available in both German and Italian. Today, I want to show you some selected results on participant views on dynamic consent and on participation in research from two empirical studies that we conducted. As dynamic consent is conceived with a participant-centered approach, we regularly monitor participant views through empirical studies. We value understanding participant perspective, and we are interested in how dynamic consent and participation in research are perceived and experienced by CRIS participants. This allows us to improve policy, communication, and dynamic consent itself, and to better meet participant needs in respect to research participation. The results are included in two manuscripts, so one is currently in preparation and the other one is currently under review. A survey with a subsample of 508 CRIS participants was conducted in 2014. The survey aimed to understand participants' perception of the dynamic consent and satisfaction with some of its specific features, such as granularity of options, regular communication, consent flexibility, and satisfaction with the information provided and with the communication strategy. Respondents were asked to rate each of the statements that you see here in the middle with a score from 0 to 10, according to the degree of agreement with the statement. Here you see the question, the respective team on the left, and count per score interval on the right. Most participants, from 70% to more than 90%, assigned the highest score, that is 9 or 10, to each item, indicating that they were satisfied with the information received, the multimedia approach improved their understanding, the electronic informed consent was found usable, the consent granularity ensured respect for their will, regular communication and consent flexibility were of value for them, and most respondents highly endorsed the study. In the second study, we collected participant views on recall by genotype, a research approach consisting of re-inviting research participants on the basis of their genotype. Recall by genotype enables the further study of a particular variant of interest, but in recalling participants, it risks the disclosure of potentially unwanted or distressing information, genetic information. So any recall by genotype strategy must be done in a manner that addresses the potential ethical and social issues. The study conducted in 2018 consisted of 2 surveys and an interview. And the study was embedded within a recall by genotype study with a subsample of CRIS participants. which were either heterozygous carriers or controls of a specific Parkin gene variant. The recall by genotype aimed to study the phenotypical effect of the variant in relation to Parkinson's disease. The variant in heterozygosis does not cause Parkinson, but may cause mild symptoms. Participants who were recruited within families were informed on the type of variant and on the disease under study, but not on the individual carrier status, either control or carrier of the variant. And we explore all the phases of this recall by genotype and also in hypothetical further studies. The invitation to participate did cause concerns related to carrier status and to the disease. For example, some participants assumed that they were carrier of the variant and that the whole family was affected. But participation was perceived as a positive experience. The disclosure of the disease under study was important for participants and framed within the reciprocity, transparency, and trust relationship with the study that the participants showed to have. Participants showed very nuanced views on what they would like to be disclosed and on the impact of such disclosure in its negative and positive aspects. As in recall by genotype approaches, the invitation itself includes disclosure of information that the participant may not want to know. We believe that it is important that the informed consent address all these nuances beforehand. So based on the findings on the positive role of multimedia in participant understanding and the value of regular communication for participants, we are continuously working on the improvement of our communication strategy, which is intended not only to keep participants informed, but also promote research participation and participant engagement. For example, we are currently developing the new CRIS website, designed for participants, which will provide information on the study on participants' rights, but also tools for scientific and health literacy. Considering the nuanced views on that participants had about disclosure of information in the recall by genotype approach and the relevance of multiple choices for the respect of their will, and the importance of changing decision over time, we are in the process of recall by genotype policy development for the CRIS study. Within the PhD project of a student in our group, we have planned further qualitative and quantitative studies to collect all the relevant data for policy design. We believe that dynamic consent is an adequate tool to deal with recall by genotypes, as it offers the possibility of addressing participant needs in a nuanced way. The CRIS return of results policy is an example of what I mean, and of how the empirical findings were used for policy improvement in the CRIS study. The return of results policy was adjusted based on the findings from empirical studies, which showed that participants wanted to make autonomous choices and according to specific criteria. Now, the CRIS dynamic consent offers participants to choose if they want to be informed, do not want to be informed, or informed only if relevant for relatives, for different types of genetic results exemplified by 4 diseases. Considering the high endorsement, the high participation rate in sub-studies, which was above 70% in general, the willingness to participate in further research, and the relationship with the study based on transparency, reciprocity, and trust, we can say that the CRIS court is engaged with the study, and that we believe that the CRIS study managed to develop a partnership relationship with participants, which we value and we want to maintain, of course. So as a whole, understanding participant perspective and keeping it into account in co-production of policy allows us to dynamically improve dynamic consent while better meeting ethical standards. And that's all, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Biasiotto. As before, very effective and clear. Just a couple of immediate reactions, because clearly what you described, it's a success story, a great success story, because actually you have a high rate of engagement. So I would start, I'm asking some questions that I don't want you to answer now, but just to prepare for the discussion instead, because did you analyze whether or not such a high rate of success has to do with social instances? That is, the kind of research projects that by default, if you are dealing with genetic diseases, somehow reach an high level of engagement because of actual interest in, as a matter of personal entanglement with the issue, or with the fact with a smaller community, so that could be more easily engaged, or as I would expect as well, the characteristics of the platform you designed and used had a specific role in such a high rate of success. Translating, in other words, do we have a success story that can teach in a very pragmatical way some guidelines to have other success story? And the question naturally leads to Christian and Tommaso, who very kindly did a sort of um, survey and analysis on what some examples, some further examples on this issue. So I will leave to Tommaso and Christian immediately the floor. Thanks again for your participation and efforts, and I look forward to listen to you as well.
Good morning, everyone. Can you see my screen? Just a thumbs up. Perfect. And can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for having us here. Tommaso Krepek speaking. Thank you very much. I'm from Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and together with Christian, who is my colleague and friend, we're going to talk to you about why do we believe that dynamic consent can be used as a very powerful tool to make data governance more responsive in the benefit of the data subject, or let's call it the participant of the study. Now, of course, the idea of dynamic consent is born as a concept in digital trials, in clinical trials. But however, nowadays, we all know how clinical trials and medical research in general are extremely data dependent. And we've seen this before. So there's reliance on telemedicine, on distant monitoring through the use of IoT devices. It's a combination of e-health and mobile health together. And of course, it requires more and more personal data sharing. Now, the data that are being shared are not only personal, but also of very sensitive nature. Now, the legal basis for the processing of this big amount of sensitive data is, in most cases, in legal terms, explicit consent. Now, what is the problem with explicit consent? Why is it hard to get explicit consent? Well, normal consent is sometimes fatiguing for a data subject. There is such a thing as consent fatigue, that you have to say yes and yes and yes to cookies and pop-ups and privacy notices. It is fatiguing at some point. Sometimes, as we've seen before, together also with Professor Comandé, consent, sometimes it's given in too much of a broad form. So it's not specific enough. And most importantly, what has been stressed by the researchers before me is that consent ages super bad, not only bad. Now, changes happen. There are multiple types of nature of changes. You have legal changes where the law might change, or the privacy policy might change, or even a contract might change. There are changes that might have to do with the technology. So the technology of collection technologies, techniques, but also advances in data analytics that can discover more than you were supposed to discover before, but also can be bigger computing resources. Let's think of quantum technology and data analytics, but also scientific discoveries. And last but not least, changes can be of personal nature. One person can finally change its opinions, or its circumstances can change. Now, we believe that what does dynamic consent do is give an answer to the need of a data governance system that is more adaptive to this change that we just mentioned and has to respond timely. Now, there is such an idea of just-in-time consent. And simplicity put, the idea is that the enjoyment of a right has also to do with the practicalities that you need to get that right enforced with requests and whatnot, and the timeliness in which the enforcement is provided. Now, there's also such thing as justice in when is this consent form provided to the data subject. So it has to be timely at that very moment in which it needs to be. So giving consent now for something that I might be doing in 3 years' time, very broadly, it's not good consent forms. As we discussed before, in dynamic consent, it's an approach to informed consent that allows communication, so communication between the data subject, so the patient and the physician. But what I'm most interested in is in the part of engagement. So it enables engagement with data subject and the participant. And the participant can review its consent decisions, review practices over time, and most importantly, when they choose so. Now, dynamic consent is a response to what we saw before as the problems of normal consent. You can specifically tailor types of consent. So you can give consent to just specific kind of consents. And this really, it kind of addresses the problem of broad consensus. You can change consent preferences, as we said before. And there's something that I call bidimensional scalability, which is a characteristic I'm interested in. That is, you have bidimensional in space, vertical and horizontal, and in time. Vertical and horizontal, what I mean is, in space, I mean vertically as in the type of consent that you can give to the same trial. So you can give consent to this, but not to this, but maybe for this purpose I like it, but not for this one purpose I don't like it. And then horizontally, in terms of more trials, as we discussed before. So, and that's against consent fatigue, because you can, let's say, centralize the consent into one place. And then, of course, bidimensionals in time. So you can review it at different moments. Now, dynamic consent is more than GDPR compliance. It is a privacy-enhancing technology that has to do more with the privacy idea of Westing, let's say, that is that of information self-determination. So it's the claim of an individual, of a group, or even institution that to determine for themselves when, how, and let's say to what extent information about them is communicated to others. Now, it's perfect for some more conditions of consent that normal consent forms wouldn't allow for. That is, you have a right to withdraw, but this right to withdraw, as Article 7 of GDPR says, shall be as easy to withdraw as to give. And this form of consent actually implements this request from the GDPR. We've discussed plentifully about the explicit consent part. It's a perfect tool for purpose specification. It's a perfect tool also for data minimization. Now, why do we say that it's more than GDPR compliance? Because the idea of dynamic consent goes perfectly well with the, let's say, the European Commission's agenda, the policy agenda on what's going to be the future of the, let's say, the digital market. So in the way, in future-proof governance, we have the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act, and perhaps even more importantly, the Data Governance Act. And all these combined are, let's say, they are paving the way for a system of dynamic consent to be perfectly implemented in. And I leave the next part of implementation to my friend Christian. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Okay, can you see the screen? Okay, so thank you, Tommaso, and good afternoon, everyone. very excited to introduce you two implementation of dynamic consent in a real case scenario. One is called Control and is a health services research project. The other one is a blockchain framework. But let's say, don't think for a minute that this is just a research project, because the same approach has been used in the industry today. For example, if you have an Android phone, for sure, until 6 months ago, you used the same approach with consent. So what is the main idea of Control? Control is a web-based application that creates an interface tool to support participants to make consent choices over a long period of time. The tool is used in the study of genomics and where consent information covers usually a broad range of topics, from health information, privacy, family information. And given such complexity, as Tommaso said, the consent form can be very long and it is difficult for participants to understand all of the necessary information. So the approach adopted by Control is to have a first page with a registration page for the first login that you see with the number 1 on the left. Here, participants are guided through a 4-step consent wizard, where they have to confirm their understanding on at least 4 macro areas. In this specific case, as it is related with genomic, it's having the genomic test, participating to the results, returning results, and even feature sharing. Then, as you see on the number 2, the picture on the left, on the right, on completion of this first form, users are redirected to a dashboard where they can granularly select the consent that they want, that they prefer, and they can also modify their personal data, their personal information. So a quick look at the architecture of Control. It's pretty simple. It's quite simple because it's just a web page. There is a database where data about users is stored, and a web page. The main drawback of using a web page is that you don't have a push notification. So instead of having like a web application like you have on Android or iOS, you have just email notification. And this is a downside. The positiveness is that administrators don't need to upload applications, or so the life cycle of the entire framework is pretty straightforward. But the main drawback is about the trusted third party, because here the administrator of the domain, the web page, in this case the Control website, is also the administrator of the entire domain. So he has the power to modify your consent, to modify your data, or even if the website has a data breach, a malicious user can modify your personal data, steal your data. So this is a big issue from this point of view. We need to trust a third-party user, the domain in this case. The last issue is data governance. When you select the consent on a data, usually you can also accept that your information is spread across several organizations. These organizations may be also even outside the European Union. Withdrawing a consent, it's easy if it is on a single database, on a single domain, while it's quite difficult to retrieve information that are spread in different organizations. So from a technical point of view, this is a big issue and a big research topic at this moment. An alternative solution an alternative solution is an alternative solution comes with the blockchain framework. This model is not used just in healthcare system, but as you can see here from the 3 actors, is compliant with the GDPR. So there is the data subject, the data controller, and the data processor. We use a blockchain in this case to avoid using a trusted third party. So the model offers to the data subject the advantage to easily decide where the data goes, for what purpose, and by whom it is processed. Why? Because we use a blockchain to store each single transaction in a transparent way. So if you see just a quick look at how it works, the number one is the data subject gives the consent to process his personal information to the data controller, and at the same time, along with that, a digital version of the consent is stored into the blockchain. The data controller can share your data with the data processor, number three, and at the same time, the data controller must also record the transaction, number four, on the blockchain. This transaction contains all the relevant information of the data subject, the data processor, and even for the purpose of the consent. Finally, the data processor can also register its processing activity on the blockchain. So using a blockchain in this case allows to use dynamic consent, but we don't need to rely on a trusted third party like we did before with the previous example. Because in this case, the data subject can also see the history of the transaction on the blockchain. We know that it is tamper-proof, and it doesn't need to rely on a data controller. The main drawback in this case is that every transaction costs. I won't say that costs an arm and a leg, but it costs a bit of money. I mean, in Ethereum network, for example, it may cost $10 per transaction for if you are an issuer of a certificate. So this is something that we should keep into account when we think about my research topic in particular, that is digital identity. What I'm trying to do with my other colleagues here in France, in Toulouse, is to embed dynamic consent and the positiveness of blockchain framework into the digital identity model, because I believe that there is a spot to use the great innovation of dynamic consent even in the digital ecosystem. To do this, we strongly believe that we need to embed the consent into the information that the data subject shared with the verifier. This is a bit of my research topic, and if you're interested, you can contact me. Thank you from me and Tommaso. Open for any question.
Thank you both, guys. In the perfect spirit of LeADS, you merged the legality attentive analysis with technological side, as expected by both of you. So that's I was betting right. So that's excellent. Thank you. And immediately, I mean, what you said raises a number of questions, because first of all, and my questions are for the discussion, but they are meant to lead to what Julia is expected to say in a moment in her presentation. That is, on the one hand, there are a number of issues that you raised, both in terms of costs, not only in terms of economic costs, but also in terms of social costs. Because, for instance, leveraging blockchain and or other highly energy demanding possibilities has clearly an environmental impact, a social impact. So we will start thinking in terms of universalizing dynamic consent, because if it is worth doing from an ethical point of view, for a fundamental rights protection point of view, for one kind of research, virtually should be extended universally. I'm just broadening the scope. So we have to be minded also of other costs which are not directly monetized, for instance, on the one hand. So again, the choice between blockchain, as you rightly stressed, and national identity, digital identities may also run along those lines. So one of the questions that leads to a policy decision, by the way, and that leads actually to to Julia's in that respect, it's whether or not we might want or need to link dynamic consent to official digital identities. So on this, for instance, that could be also helpful for your own research, Christian, and for the portability and PIMS part in Tommaso's one. Think about the Italian model, which is growing of the speed. We now do have a trusted identity and a way of somehow certify documents by our speed, by our identity. That might, on the one hand, solve a number of issues and open the field towards a European based that requires some form of recognition, like the Green Pass, by the way, of the national identities as a way of authenticating and unique way of authenticating in a manifold possible platforms, not only charm, but a number of charms that can have different architecture, different technologies, different needs. And these different technologies, different needs directly open to the topic and title of Dr. Snyder, I mean, the possible interplay between dynamic consent and other legal bases in research in the GDPR. So you have the floor, Julia. Thank you very much.
Professor Comandé. Thanks to the previous speakers. I hope that now you can see my screen. Perfect. You should be able to see it. Perfect. So first of all, as I was mentioning, thanks for this invitation, and in particular, thanks for the previous speakers, and particularly the talk by Tommaso and Christian, which actually outline the possible technical implementation scenarios of this delicate notion of dynamic consent. As we were referring to blockchain technologies, we start seeing how technology could be a way, a positive way to implement dynamic consent solution in the practice. And with that, technical solution could be also a means maybe to fill some gaps that are still particularly concerning in respect to data protection law. So what I want to discuss with you today is basically the general question of how dynamic is consent under the GDPR. And as we will see, hopefully in a moment, and as hopefully will be apparent after my presentation, the GDPR leaves open some great spaces of dynamisms of consent, which could be in turn particularly concerning in terms of the protection of the rights of the subject involved. So the underlying general question is exactly to which extent does the GDPR promote research through these general concept of dynamic research, and with that also secondary uses. And to try to strictly identify the borders of the notion of dynamic consent appears to be specifically important in the context, in our present European policy context. We all know that the European Commission nearly 2 years ago now has published the European Strategy for Data, in which this very challenging concept of European data spaces has been advanced, where both public and private players are expected to share data for the common good, the common European good, which is basically research, which is the introduction and the promotion of new products, of new goods and services within the European digital market. And a guiding principle that has been set within this European Strategy for Data is exactly that data have to be shared, have to be processed in a manner that is as open as possible and as close as necessary. And so in respect to this very general principle, we have today to ask ourselves how dynamic consent under the GDPR opens up for the sharing of data, and to which extent it also closes the limits and the borders for the sharing of these data. And the question to define dynamic consent is even more important in light of the use of the term consent also in other European regulation, for example, first of all, the forthcoming Data Governance Act, which has been just approved and which will hopefully come to a final approval. And so there in the Data Governance Act, there is reference specifically in respect to the data altruism part, which is exactly related to the sharing of data for these data altruistic purposes, which are generally referred and connected to general interest purposes, which is triggered, the sharing of data for data altruism purposes, by consent, as the Data Governance Act expressly refers to. So the question arises, is consent under the GDPR similar to the consent that is referred to under the Data Governance Act? But before answering to this more complex question, we have to really address what consent and dynamic consent is under the GDPR. And the answer is actually to this question is not so simple as it appears. And now we will see in a moment why. Now, going back to the very technical legal basis, consent is defined under paragraph 11 of Article 4, and is defined as any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the data subject wishes, by which he or she, by a statement or by clear affirmative action, signifies agreement to the processing of personal data relating to him or her. So with this definition, actually the GDPR recalls the definition that was to be found in the previous directive, but with an additional element, the fact that consent has to be specific, informed, unambiguous, and it has to have these very specific features, exactly because the GDPR acknowledges that we are in a digital environment, in a digital space where the trend is that of the existence of significant imbalances between data subjects and controllers, which are mostly digital platforms. And this element has been very much explored by Article 29 Data Protection Working Party, which has actually also highlighted the importance for data controllers to implement additional organizational and procedural requirements exactly regarding consent. And these are actually to be found under Article 7 of the GDPR. The controller shall request the consent in a manner which is clearly distinguishable from the other matters, and again in an intelligible and easily accessible form, which is not always the case in our daily practice, and also shall be able, through adequate measures of data governance, to demonstrate that the data subject has consented to processing of his or her personal data. And through the reference of these general measures of data governance, again, the very big question arises, which have to be these measures of data governance, and here the technical element comes into place. Maybe blockchain technology could be a measure of data governance which serves the purposes of the provision that we have just cited. But actually, the applicability and the relevance of consent in the digital environment, and with his very general objective that Tommaso was also mentioning in respect to the data subject self-determination, the preservance of data subject autonomy and dignity, has been much questioned, not only because of the significant imbalances that we have already mentioned, which exist between data subjects and data controller in the digital space, but also because of other very, we can say, factual elements that relate to the big data nature of the data, which is constantly disclosed in the digital environment, which is quite difficult to trace also from a data subject perspective. And also the fact that data controllers and the transfer, the repurposing of data purposing among different data controllers is a reality with which we have to sort of make reference. So now the question is that research is based on the data sharing, the data repurposing among various data controllers. So the question is, which role is left for consent? Actually, the GDPR provides an answer to that by acknowledging the possibility under Recital 33 to provide a sort of open, a more open consent in respect to, as it said, to certain areas of scientific research when in keeping with recognized ethical standard for scientific research. So the recital 33 places a first important limit for open consent, for dynamic consent, which is this compliance with ethical standards for scientific research. And this has been read by the literature as a reference to codes of conduct in case there are some, and this is actually a problem because in many cases, no codes of conduct have been yet issued in respect, for example, to the digital health research case. And another strand of the literature has actually widely interpreted the reference to ethical standard in terms as the need to get an approval by ethics committees. So in these terms, we see that this broad consent, this dynamic consent is actually not so open, although relating to broad areas of scientific research, it has to remain bounded to a basis related either to the respect of codes of conduct or through the approval by ethics committees. In addition to that, Article 29 of the Data Protection Working Party has underlined how research purposes, these areas of research to which dynamic consent has to be attached to, need to be well described, although not fully specified. This is actually quite tricky because it is not easy to understand to which extent the consent can be the research areas to which consent is attached to can be well described, although not fully specified. And but what is interesting in that is that Article 29 of the Data Protection Working Party highlights that the lack of specified purposes, when the research purposes are not fully specified, then data controllers shall implement additional safeguards. First of all, a comprehensive research plan, and also very important transparency measures which enable data subjects to retrieve consent. And with these transparency measures, again, we have to think at the technical capabilities and the technical tools which may serve these purposes. Now, in light also of this specification of the Article 29 Data Protection Party, the big question which remains open is which is the relationship between Recital 33 and the specific consent that, especially in the context of the processing of special categories of data, Article 9, Paragraph 2, letter A of the GDPR requires. First of all, we have to remain conscious that we are talking, the reference to dynamic consent is only included within a recital. And so the specific purposes to which the consent is being attached have to remain a benchmark that cannot be dissolved. Now, nonetheless, we have to still consider and to face the great practical uncertainties that the notion of dynamic consent in the GDPR, this very broad notion of dynamic consent, which is entailed in the GDPR, leaves open. And these uncertainties are not destined to be lessened, but rather worsened if we talk and if we consider the possible interplays with these dynamic consent and other legal bases that, for example, the same Article 9, Paragraph 2 of the GDPR sets for the processing of specific categories of data. But before looking at this possible interplay, we have also to remember that the GDPR sets a so-called default compatibility rule under the combined reading of Article 6, Paragraph 4 and Article 5, Paragraph 1, letter B of the GDPR, which actually states that the purpose specification, the purpose limitation principle can be derogated when the secondary processing is conducted for research purposes. Because when the secondary processing conducted for research purposes are enacted, then research purposes are to be considered under GDPR as automatically compatible with the original purposes to which consent has been given. Now, this is the full compatibility rule potentially opens up to an infinite circles of data processes under the umbrella of research. Now, other possible legal bases, and here comes actually the tricky part can be found, for example, that the processing is legitimate when it is necessary for reasons of substantial public interest, or again for research purposes. So the processing of personal data for research purposes, when it comes to special categories of data, is an autonomous legal basis in respect to consent, provided specific conditions are met. First conditions are the respect and the enactment of specific measures that safeguard the fundamental rights and the interests of the data subject. But provided these safeguards are enacted, and we'll see in a moment which these safeguards could potentially be, specific derogations to general data subjects' rights are allowed. For example, derogation to the right to erasure, to the right to access, and also additional derogations can be affirmed, can be enacted under national law in accordance to Article 89, paragraph 2 of the GDPR. Of course, these derogations are meant to enable and to facilitate the processing of data for research purposes under this specific legal basis. Now, we have seen that by interpreting the notion of dynamic consent, the Article 29 Data Protection Working Group has already set specific safeguards. These safeguards are exactly the same, we can say, to which Article 89 GDPR refers to in the specific context of research. We can highlight general data protection, general safeguards, as for example, the conduction of data protection impact assessment, the records of the processing activity, the respect of codes of conduct. These are nonetheless general rules which are automatically applicable if a processing activity intends to be consistent with the GDPR. In addition to these, we can highlight and we can identify, for example, the enactment of pseudonymization techniques, and also the standards and certification under other applicable frameworks, for example, in the context of medical devices or in the context of clinical trial. Now, with that, I open up to some open question, which leaves open the delicate balance between dynamic consent and other legal bases. We have seen some similarities. We have seen that both in respect to dynamic consent and other legal bases for research, specific safeguards have to be enacted for the legitimate processing of these personal data. Now, actually, only in respect to other legal bases, such as the one of consent, the specific derogations are possible. These derogations are not possible in the context of dynamic consent. So in this perspective, maybe dynamic consent appears to be more protecting, a more protective option for the data subject. But the question here is also which is the relationship between dynamic consent and other legal bases in the case of consent withdrawal. Now, first of all, the GDPR under recital 162 sets a general principle of segregation. This principle of segregation is outlined in respect to the specific case of processing for statistical purposes, but we have generally interpreted this principle of segregation as being a principle of general nature which can be applied to every types of processes. This principle of segregation is a sort of specification of the principle of purpose limitation, and it means that once the specific processing activities have been conducted in a specific consent, if the context and thus the purposes of the processing change, then also new legal bases have to be enacted. So, For example, if a specific processing activities has been conducted against the backdrop of the legitimate basis of research, if the context and the purposes of this research differ significantly from the original ones, then other legal bases are needed, and in this perspective, consent is again needed. The European Data Protection Board has actually stated and has provided clarification, greater clarification in this sense. It has stated that the favorite legal basis for research is always informed, specific, and free consent. In case of consent withdrawal, nonetheless, the European Data Protection Board has actually opened up to the possibility of further processing personal data under other legal bases. So in this respect, this interpretation is a more generous interpretation, which does not appear to be that consistent with the principle of segregation that I have just outlined. Now, very briefly, and I come to an end, the complexities of the interplay between consent, withdrawal of consent, and other legal bases have become apparent in the specific case of Tiziana Life Science versus Shardna case. Now, the question dealt with Shardna. It was a Sardinian genetic bank which actually processed genetic data for public interest, non-profit purposes. These genetic data that Shardna had collected was further transferred and was shared with a for-profit company, UK-based company, Tiziana Life Science. Now, Tiziana Life Science claimed to have the right to further process the data on the basis of the consent that had been previously given by Sardinian citizens to Shardna, a non-profit organization. Now here, the Italian Data Protection Authority immediately intervened, blocking the processing by Tiziana Life Science, saying a new consent is required. So in other terms, the Italian Data Protection Authority actually did nothing else than applying in a more severe way the principle of segregation. The Tribunal of Cagliari overturned this decision and claimed that actually the same consent was sufficient, was adequate, because all the activities both by Shardna and by Tiziana Life Science were processing activities conducted for research purposes. Now, this decision was further succeeded by a further ruling by the Italian Data Protection Authority, which stated that the withdrawal of consent that the Sardinian citizens by then had enacted renders further processing activities not legitimate. So there is a need of new consent. So we see a divergence of interpretation of this principle of segregation by the Italian Data Protection Authority with a more severe approach, and the Tribunal of Cagliari with a more generous approach, a more facilitating approach, we can say. Now, getting to an end, I leave on the table a few open questions. Now, can we, against the backdrop of the framework that we just highlighted, operate a differentiation of legal bases that must apply to different types of research? So can we make a differentiation between public interest and commercial-oriented research, saying that when it comes to commercial-oriented research, consent, also a dynamic consent, although interpreted in a more restrictive way, has to be applied, and that only public interest-oriented research activity can benefit from the more facilitating legal basis of public interest, as we say, or of research? Then another question is, to which extent is the default compatibility rule applicable exactly when it comes to the switching of different types of research? Another question that still has not to be adequately addressed is the identification of safeguards that have to be applied in the context of different types of research. And then specifying these general questions in the realm of dynamic consent, can also dynamic consent be differentiated in the context and for the purposes of different types of research? So with these questions that I think are really interested to look at in a very future time, in the next events that we can make here also at Sant'Anna School of Advanced Study in the context of our research project. I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Just for the sake of shortness, I would just comment as we always need a plan B with consent. Especially with dealing with the research, if we don't want to somehow throw away the research done. Because what happens if consent is withdrawn? What are the implications? And I think you very clearly spoke both the problems and potential solutions in that. So now we have all the background, I think, on the table. There are already a number of questions that were opened by all the speakers. But before eventually giving room for a sort of round table to reactions to the speakers, I would like to see if there are questions, comments, intervention from the speakers, from the audience. So, is there any specific question, matter that any of you want to raise, questions to ask? All right, so let's break the ice. I have already summarized several questions for everybody. So let me ask to the speaker if there is some reaction on the cross-cutting issues and questions. I don't know if Deborah wants to break the ice, being
Sure, happy to do so.
Yeah,
I think that actually we faced quite a few questions that are actually overlapping a bit with itself. It very much depends what we mean with dynamic consent when we try to address some of the issues that Julia was bringing to the table right now, for instance, because dynamic consent can be framed very differently. I want to highlight a couple of points here. One is that consent is not only consent to the processing of data, and that we should have in mind this difference quite clearly when we think about the processing of data, because consent in research is also meant as consent to the participation in research. And there, it is also framed within a very rich and substantial literature of ethical tradition and ethical literature as well. So Kira Stanton did work, for instance, on the recognized ethical standards in the GDPR. What does this mean? Because it's not really precise in the GDPR. And she digged back into this rich ethical literature as well. Because let's not forget, the re-identification is not the only issue, is not the only ethical issue in the use of data. I mean, I can give data that can never be recognized, but that can lead to research that is highly unethical unless there are really systems in place that ensure that research is conducted in an ethically sound manner. Let's say research that proves that females are stupid, or that gender issues are driving in a certain way instead of another, etc. And we've had example of this type of research coming from biobank research. So even when we speak about public interest and different legal bases, we need to have this in mind, that reuse of data and samples does not only entail a privacy re-identificatory mean, but also an integrity mean for the people that provide consent. So in my opinion, if we rely on consent as legal basis for research and an interactive one, in which we actually ask people to trust us through the information that we are providing and through the details we are providing, then we should stay substantially on the same line and allow them to withdraw if they want to do so and they have reasons to do so. So I think this is really like a very complex issue probably that we should address in the future. This is also linked to the identification of individuals issue, as we know that in the Nordics there are already systems in place that work quite substantially for national identifications of individuals, and the SPID now is a system in Italy, much more complex, I must say, being also based in Sweden. I must testify that the Swedish system is much simpler. Yeah, of course, this is a way forward. But the cost is not something that we should underestimate, because the cost has always been one of the reasons for which dynamic consent has not been implemented so far. And therefore, we really need to find ways that are that we can realize also in terms of cost and that are suitable for research purposes. Of course, in Norway, for instance, they created a system of dynamic consent that is my page, and that is valid for all the research that is conducted on the national level. So this could solve some of the cost issue, for instance, along with the identificatory mean issues. But I think I talked already too much, so I leave the floor to the rest of the speakers.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I think you raised very key point that actually one of the key point raised by the European Data Protection Board, it's exactly the one that with specific reference to data protection in relation with clinical trials, the acquisition of consent, since the reasons for processing and the techniques for processing the data may change the status of the data. The suggestion explicitly given is that even in case of withdrawal of consent, there might be some conditions in which data could still be used for research on the one end, and it has tried to give meaning to the fact that the previous processing activity are not invalid. And what are the implications? Because if we think in terms of a biobank, it's more visible your very legitimate and shared concern about, okay, we ask to trust and give consent, but in other area, or when as I'm looking at through in several projects, the use of the genetic data, for instance, data broadly speaking, it's a generator for instance, AI-driven tools or outputs. Then there is an issue whether or not you will have a very strong implication on the generated model, because although the processing was legitimate, now I'm withdrawing and still you are using those data in the generated model for testing. So the other legitimate basis would save that output despite of the withdrawal. So I think you are absolutely right. It's a very relevant issue that we might need to tackle jointly as well in future activities. But I'm talking too much. So who else wants to interact and react? And if there are newcomers from the audience, feel free, just open your camera and show up. I don't know if you want to give some answers to the many questions that were raised in a very cross-referring ways. Yes, Dr. Biasotto. Dr. Biasotto, please.
Yes, thanks. No, actually, I want to address that the question that you made just after my presentation. So I want to talk about that. So I was thinking that this, let's say, success story from the CRE study could be related both to the relationship with the community and also to the characteristic of the platform, if we call it this way. So this is because I think that the relationship with the community and with the participants was built up over a long time. Actually, some research projects started many years ago and then developed further into the CRIS study. Then there is also the involvement of the GPs and the community, and the CRIS study is also important for prevention, because when you participate, you get a health check. So people are motivated not only by interest in research, because they said about that they are interested in common goods, benefits for future generation, but also pragmatically they get this health check, so it's useful for them. And on the other hand, we see also that the platform was kind of appreciated. So the possibility of changing options was important for them. Or also receiving regular communication was important. We saw that also in the survey, older people liked particularly that option, for example. So to have also updates from the study, and in a way also to, I can say maybe to understand more, I think they are quite receptive. So it could be that there is this local dimension that built up a strong relationship and result in this success. But also I think that there is the contribution of the tool itself that can help in better addressing their needs, their interests, their values when they are participating. I don't know if Deborah wants to add more on that.
Yes, I think that addressing Professor Comanda's first question, similar studies that also have platforms in place, but not a dynamic consent in place and not a dynamic communication in place, have much lower participation rates, even though like the goals are similar and like the genetic research is similar. Let's say the UK Biobank, but also other studies. But significantly different. So like UK Biobank comes to a 14% participation rate against between a 70 and 80% of the CRIS study. So I think it's something more. And I think that this communication part that Roberta was addressing is really key. Because again, we don't understand the dynamic consent as this online thing. It's really like a process. So it's really more embedded into the ethical tradition of what consent is.
Several comments too, but I see that Chara Stoughton has opened her camera. So please introduce very, very briefly who you are before shooting the question, please.
Hi, thank you. So it's Dr. Kira Staunton. I'm with Deborah's group in Bolzano. Not really some questions, just kind of some comments or thoughts that came to me over the past hour and a half, which was fantastic. I think from all of the international studies we're seeing increasingly, we know from, for example, your DNA, your SAY, cyber governance projects that's going on, people increasingly want control over what is happening to the data. And it's not just because of privacy issues, as Deborah mentioned. There is a problem there is a risk that because of the GDPR, we're just focusing too much on data protection, which is just one subset of privacy, and in ignoring other rights, which are incredibly important in the research domain. Now, like the GDPR, of course, it isn't a standalone regulatory standard for research, but of course, because of all of the impact that it has in research, is becoming incredibly important. But the work that Deborah mentioned what we've done looking at this particular safeguards is that we advocated for a bioethics integrated approach to this area. And the beauty of dynamic consent is that it enables that to happen. Even if you are engaged where your legal basis of processing of data is not consent, dynamic consent is incredibly useful as a safeguard under the GDPR, I would argue. It also enables participants to exercise their rights easily, which includes withdrawal of consent. We often talk about how consent must be as easy to withdraw as it is to consent, when in reality, that often isn't possible. But with the likes of dynamic consent, it really, really facilitates and enables that. And it's a very clear and transparent process in which you are processing using data in the context of research. I think it's also important for us to look back, like a lot of mention was made of Article 29 Working Party documents, which are great, but I think we really need to start looking more closely at the more recent documents that's coming up from the EDPB. We are waiting, of course, for his long-awaited report on scientific research. But I think the preliminary opinion that came out early 2020, I think at this stage, is quite insightful in discussion on particular safeguards and broad consent. And it's this notion of how broad can broad consent be? Well, it depends upon the context in which you're in. Whereas dynamic consent kind of facilitate that process and offset some of the challenges or the problems that we may ethically have with regards to broad consent. But I think also what's quite interesting is that the importance of focusing on this balance, and the more, I would argue that the more recent literature coming from the EDPB really tries to talk about balance, particularly in relation to COVID data, more broadly in the context of health, but particularly in the context of health research, where they're focusing upon enabling, facilitating medical research while balancing data protection and other rights. So I think it's important, I'll just leave it here, that we're not to lose sight of the other rights that are equally important in this domain.
Very agreeable comment, I would say, Dr. Stanton, for sure. And I would add, I mean, in agreement with you, I would add that data protection has an important role to play these days as one of the more regulated, if you want, right, and therefore offering a benchmark. For instance, which is an ethical issue that actually I would have loved to address with Roberta Biasotto, because for instance, consent under the GDPR needs to be clearly distinguished from other issues, and there are specific clauses clarifying the impossibility, at least theoretical ones, to do that, a tying between consent to personal data processing and other services, right? So I mean, my consent cannot be somehow linked. Okay, let's put the other way around. My obtaining a service or a product cannot be linked to give consent to data processing, which is not necessary, strictly necessary to that services or product. Okay. And this is regulated. This is actually in stone, Deborah, right? It's in the law. We don't have. We are still work at an ethical level when we deal with, for instance, not linking consent to participate in a clinical trial, but some countries, some guidelines, ethical guidelines, allow for reimbursement or allow for providing some healthcare services, and which are extremely useful, helpful, for instance, in some countries, like in African countries, but some other ethicists view this very fact, which is a good point, as Roberta stressed, as an possibly undue enticement that may affect consent being unethical to provide that kind of services. So with that respect, referring to personal data protection regulation as a sort of benchmark of, if you want, sometimes over-regulated if you compare to other situations, can offer a benchmark which is useful. But I do agree with you that somehow we are all over-referring to data processing as an ethics issue. I fully agree with that. But still, it may offer a benchmark to discuss, at least, maybe not to solve parallel issues like the ones I just mentioned. So really, thank you for this very insightful set of comments, actually. So thanks a lot. Now we have moved way away from our original deadline that was 2:30, but definitely was worthwhile. So let me ask if there is any comment, question, or any compelling remark that anyone in the audience or among the speakers want to do. and to make. Otherwise, I must say a really huge thank you to all the speakers for this very insightful and challenging introductions. I think we now are very much more aware, not only on dynamic consent, but also on the various twists and turns that are related to them. So this has been, I think, very helpful, at least for me. I think also for Deborah and everybody, to start thinking on further work. So we are not only more aware, but more aware of what we have to do in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you for the LeADS community that I see as joined us in a numerous way, not only as speakers, but also as audience, and from several continents, by the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.